very stimulating questions. Colleagues, the invocation of the Emergency Act awakens in me distressing and painful feelings, as I believe it does in many of my Quebec colleagues, because it evokes a dark period in our shared history. In October 1970, I was 19 years old. I was a CEGEP student, and I was about to begin my university studies barely a year later. I already had a strong interest in public affairs and democracy within a Quebec society in turmoil at the end of its quiet revolution, a time that led to many reforms based on values of equality, solidarity, economic development, and openness to the world. I remember the fear brought on during the October 1970 crisis by terrorist acts perpetrated so close to my own home. The kidnapping of the British diplomat James Cross, then the tragic end to the kidnapping of Minister Pierre Laporte. I will never forget that fear. At that time, I saw firsthand the effects of applying the now-defunct War Measures Act. I witnessed in a society founded on the rule of law, a democratic society, the suspension of habeas corpus and disregard for human rights. With dismay, I observed the arbitrary arrest and abusive detention of trade union leaders, journalists, artists, including several poets, and ordinary citizens whose freedom of expression was muzzled and whose right of association was denied. In all, some 500 people were abruptly deprived of their freedoms based on mere presumptions, in defiance of the most elementary principles of justice. I was stunned by the violence, intimidation, and implacable harshness that accompanied the application of this law on Quebec territory. It is therefore in this context that I have reflected on the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act, and that I have risen to speak today, mindful of the repeal in 1988 of the War Measures Act and its replacement by the Emergencies Act. Mindful of the lessons that the government and the Parliament of Canada have learned from these sad events, aware also that the invocation of this emergency law, a law to be activated as a last resort, is a first in our history.
Is very different from the one of October 1970. First and foremost, the current Emergencies Act, adopted in 1988, is not as drastic as its predecessor and includes more oversight measures to prevent serious abuse. The application of this act requires consultation with the provinces and territories, which the government has proceeded with. While concerning situations happened in other provinces related to what is now called the Freedom Convoy, so far only Premier Ford of Ontario has publicly stated support for its use in order to resolve the situation affecting the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario. It would not be acceptable, however, that this act be enforced on the territory of other provinces, such as the Province of Quebec, without consultation and consent from the provincial and territorial governments. In this regard, the Premier of Quebec, François Legault, has been very clear in affirming the non-necessity of the application of this act in Quebec. I quote him in French, "On pense que ce n'est pas nécessaire."
We think that it is not necessary, and we saw last weekend in Quebec City that the municipal and provincial police forces were able to do their work, and we need to bring Quebecers together.
If indeed this act would be used on Quebec territory in spite of the will of the Premier and indeed all the members of the National Assembly. Furthermore, and unlike the revoked War Measures Act, the Emergencies Measures Act requires parliamentary oversight. Indeed, a parliamentary review committee composed of parliamentarians from both chambers of Parliament will diligently review the responsibilities arising from this crisis declaration. This parliamentary committee will lead an inquiry into the circumstances that gave rise to the declaration and the measures taken to deal with the crisis. It is our duty as senators and parliamentarians to proceed with this review with the utmost seriousness and consideration. Additionally, the Emergencies Act also differs from its predecessor by the fact that it is subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights. As such, fundamental rights should not be limited or abridged, even in a national emergency. Any actions taken in the context of this Act must be limited to these considerations as well as proportionate to the degree of urgency. And finally, this Act is subject to exhaustive debate and approbation from both chambers of Parliament, which we are doing today, as we are now demonstrating it. So the first question we must now ask ourselves is whether invoking the Act was necessary to put an end to the occupation in Ottawa and blockades around the country. Obviously, the situation had festered long enough and action was required. Even considering the recent successful police intervention, the infringement on the citizens' fundamental rights had been too long. In the recent weeks, we have surrendered a part of our capital city to protesters. While these protesters have the right to oppose the decision of the Government of Canada, they do not have the right to take hostage a population, block bridges and roads, as well as threaten the proper functioning of a democratic country. Even strategic access points, such as highways and airports, were targeted in total contempt of the law and of the citizens' freedom. The situation in Ottawa was illegal, highly disruptive, and had its own set of security issues which simply could not be ignored. Extraordinary occurrence, the work of both chambers of Parliament had to be suspended because of the actions of protesters, resulting in delays in debating this crucial act. This is unacceptable. And what about the heavy economic consequences that emanated from the blockade and their inevitable impact on the Canadian economy, on local businesses, and ordinary citizens? They had to be taken into consideration. Daily policing has cost around $2.5 million, at least $2.5 million. And this is with no mention of the still closed businesses and trade delays caused by the blockade. A second essential question we must ask ourselves is, were the extraordinary powers conferred by the Emergencies Act really essential, really unavoidable to putting an end to the threat of another illegal occupation? Those powers are truly extraordinary. The prohibition of public assembly and travel, the order of evacuation of people and private property, the use of specific property, the power to direct individuals and companies to render essential services, and more. So now that an end was put to the illegal occupation of Parliament Hill and downtown Ottawa because of the application of the Act, what justifies its application for the remaining 22 days provided for in the proclamation declaring a public order emergency? This has become the key question. We must hence ask ourselves if the invocation of the Emergencies Act passes the Oakes test. What is the Oakes test? In 1986, the court in R versus Oakes created this two-step balancing test to determine whether a government can justify a law which limits a charter right. First, the objective to be served by the measures limiting a charter right must be sufficiently important to warrant overriding a constitutionally protected right or freedom. Second, The party invoking S1 must show the means to be reasonable and demonstrably justified. This involves a form of proportionality test involving three important components. To begin, the measures must be fair and not arbitrary, carefully designed to achieve the objective in question, and rationally connected to that objective. In addition, the means should impair the right in question as little as possible. And lastly, there must be a proportionality between the effects of the limiting measure and the objective. The more severe the deleterious effects of a measure, the more important the objective must be. I believe we had on our hands, with blockades to strategic bridges and the occupation of our national capital, an urgent issue that needed imminent action by the government. Up to now, the act was used cautiously, with restraint, and only in specific locations. For my part, I believe the positive impacts on ordinary citizens, on the economy, and on businesses far outweigh the limitations imposed to protesters. We can study the implications of this act in a philosophical way, but we also need to be pragmatic and realist. The danger facing our country was real, and action was needed. Furthermore, following the 3-week occupation, in a letter dated February 19, addressed to Ministers Mendicino and Blair, respectively Ministers of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police stressed the ongoing necessity for those exceptional measures, and I quote, "The prohibition of financial transactions to support unlawful assemblies is critical to bringing a peaceful termination of these assemblies, as well as serving as a deterrent for other pop-up illegal assemblies." End of quote. I tend to agree that while we have made tremendous progress in the last few days, we are not out of the woods yet. Extraordinary measures such as the ability to freeze financial and control people traveling to strategic locations, financial assist, is still very much necessary until we are confident that control is regained and that protesters have gone back to their homes. The fact is that tensions are still running high in Ottawa. In the last few days, and particularly following the police intervention, staffers from my office, as I am sure those of many of my colleagues' offices, have been subjected to abuse and violent threats by supporters of the so-called Freedom Convoy. Those threats came from domestic as well as foreign individuals, people calling for the government to be overthrown, and sometimes, too often, for the Prime Minister and for members of the government to be executed. In these times of high tension, we must remain vigilant to keep the peace that the police intervention allowed us to enjoy here in Ottawa. I believe we must also have in mind the concept of precautionary principle when deciding whether to extend this act for a period of 30 days. While we don't know with absolute certitude if this act is necessary to retain law in order in our country, we do know that we can't go back to illegal blockages and unlawful occupations. That being said, I will now raise the concerns I have with further empowerment of the police with such extraordinary tools. By doing so, we need to ensure that we are not opening the door for abuses and infringement of rights. Are the checks and balances provided in the Act sufficient to prevent abuses? From what we have seen, we must congratulate our police forces for their professional and efficient way of removing children, vehicles, and protesters. They have done so for now with tact and without serious injuries or death, despite the clear attempts at disinformation, namely false accusations of police brutality and harm to protesters. Of course, the Parliamentary Review Committee will be able to judge after the fact the judicious use that will have been made of these extraordinary measures allowed by the Act. But this is not what we are debating today. Today, we have to consider consent for the implementation of the Emergencies Act to be extended for the full 30 days, that is an additional 22 days as from today. What guarantees do we have that the intentions behind it is to ensure the return to public order and that it will not be usurped by the abuse of the extraordinary powers, once again, it confers on the police forces and the government? I must also mention that although many of the protesters may have valid intentions, many of the protesters may have valid intentions and legitimate concerns, we cannot ignore the extremist movement being associated with the protests. We have all been shocked by the racist displays circulating freely around Parliament Hill, meters away from our highest democratic institution. It simply cannot be tolerated. This association with the extreme ends of the political spectrum is not limited to the displays we have seen. It has been well documented in the last weeks by government ministers and experts such as David Morin, professor and co-chair of the UNESCO Chair in Prevention of Radicalization and Violent Extremism. The situation we found and still find ourselves in is a failure. A failure resulting from what many independent and renowned safety experts have assessed as a lack of foresight, followed by initial bad management from the City of Ottawa and the Ottawa Police. These questions will have to be explored by the Parliamentary Review Committee to ensure a similar situation does not happen again. We must learn why it is that the Ottawa police authorities did not timely take the necessary precautions to prevent this illegal occupation, while other cities like Toronto, Cots, Windsor, and Quebec City were able to manage in similar circumstances. Invoking the Emergencies Act should never have been required, but I am now left with the unpleasant impression that this measure was necessary and still is. It is now far too late, and we cannot repair the damages resulting from the initial ineptitude of the local authorities. We can only continue to mitigate them and manage the enforcement of the Act in a sound, balanced, and professional manner, as we have done in the last few days. For this, I have come to the conclusion that increased powers were needed to deal with this quagmire and are still needed to maintain order in our capital city. Who here in this chamber can say with certitude that without the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the situation would have been resolved peacefully? Who can say this with certitude? However, this does not mean giving carte blanche in the attribution of those increased powers. In the February 14th announcement of his decision to invoke the Emergencies Act, the Prime Minister said that the actions taken would be, and I quote him, reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address. End of quote. This was a strong commitment, and we could then only hope that it would lead to prevent any form of abuse. So far, it worked. But we still can only hope because we have no guarantees for the remaining 22 days. This commitment still lies on the confidence and capacity of the police forces to act and to succeed without the military being called upon. The police, under the provisions of this act, are empowered to resolve the issue, and they have proven to be up to the task in the last few days. I'm satisfied with the recent actions of the police, and I only hope that this trend will continue and that we will not witness any kind of abuse would the situation worsen. In a democracy, the right to free expression is vital if and when it is expressed peacefully. I wish for a continued measured application of this powerful act with, in mind, respect to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and justice principles. At this stage, when we must acknowledge the failure to maintain law and order through normal means and channels, do we have the choice of denying the competent authorities the exceptional powers and measures they still deem necessary to maintain law and order? Could these measures ensure that the citizens of Ottawa maintain the freedom they just finally found after difficult weeks of occupation? Will they allow businesses and their employees to get back to business? I will not want to be guilty of having taken the risk to deprive them once again of their precious rights and freedoms. Those people have just found their freedom back. We now have to act cautiously. Colleagues, had we been discussing today the enforcement of the War Measures Act, this repealed law, I would never, ever have voted for it. But we are not. The courts will most probably also have the responsibility of judging the constitutionality of this act and its compliance with the Oakes test. For my part, given the parliamentary responsibility that we now have to fulfill, and out of precaution, given the lack of certitude, I will vote in favor of the confirmation of the application for the remaining 20 days or so of the Emergencies Act. Unless the government, which still has this option, deems appropriate to put an end to it earlier on the advice of the relevant authorities. I will vote in favor of the confirmation of the application of the Emergencies Act, but I will do so with deep regret. I will do so trusting that these extraordinary measures will continue to be targeted and taken with discernment. I will do so with the utmost reserve and with in mind the precautionary principle once again. By refusing to confirm the implementation of these exceptional measures, I would not want to be complicit in maintaining contempt for our democracy. Thank you, merci, miigwech.